Okay, how's my sound? We're good? Everyone can hear? Okay, perfect. You guys are trying to upstage me. Justin, ukulele? What? I think he was planted in the audience here. Well, I'm so happy to be here. It's so great to see all of you creatives who took this Friday morning to be creative. But mainly I'm happy to be here because I can pretend that I'm a U of M professor. I went to the U of M, I wasn't over on here on the St. Paul campus. I was over on the Minneapolis campus because I got a journalism degree, but they gave me a clicker. I can have it, he said, forever. Okay, so if you guys don't know me, I'm Kate Nelson. I'm an award-winning Native American journalist. I'm also currently the editor-in-chief of a magazine called Artful Living, which is a glossy, oversized lifestyle magazine that is published here in Minneapolis. Next slide, please. Dream on. I know what you guys are thinking. I inadvertently walked into an Aerosmith fan club session. I thought I was here to learn about creative stuff. No, actually what we're going to talk about today is embracing creative evolution. Because if you're in this room, you are a self-proclaimed creative, which means that you have all sorts of new ideas coming to you all the time. However, sometimes we can get boxed in and put these self-limiting definitions on ourselves as to who we are, what we do, what that means. So I'm here to talk to you about breaking out of that box. It took a long journey to get to where I currently am, so we're going to rewind. Here's little Kate. I was born in Alaska, but grew up here in Minnesota, in a small farming community. And magazines were really how I connected to the rest of the world. So I knew from a very early age that that's what I wanted to do. I actually had, it was a newspaper at the time, but I had a newspaper for my family called the Nelson News. I was the editor-in-chief. Obviously, that was my first tenure as editor-in-chief, so it was fun to return to that title again with Artful Living. Like I mentioned, I came down to the journalism school here at the U of M. I took sort of a circuitous route through public relations in the nonprofit world, all the while was still keeping that journalism and storytelling dream alive. Started working with Artful Living in 2010, first as a contract copy editor, eventually worked my way up to executive editor, and then in 2019 was named editor-in-chief. So I've been in that position for 5 years. If you guys read if you guys read the description of this talk, you might know that I'm actually going to be leaving that position. And I've chosen to step down from the editor-in-chief role to focus more on my work, amplifying Native American changemakers and topics for media outlets from Esquire to Elle, Guardian, BBC, Vanity Fair, quite a few different titles. But we're not quite there yet. Okay, so Artful Living, have been working there, like I mentioned, for 13 years. And have been just so proud of the content that we've put out. And this is really, what has helped lay the foundation for my journalism career. And so part of what I'm right now, I'm sort of in the messy middle. I'm 2 weeks away to the day from stepping down as editor-in-chief. After a 13-year-long relationship with that publication, you can imagine that I'm feeling a lot of feelings. One of them is immense pride for what we've done. One of them is this mourning, this grief of, but I worked on that for so long, and now I'm going to sort of hand off my little magazine baby to someone else. I'm also excited for my next chapter, and I'm excited for the magazine's next chapter. So let's go back to 2020. This is when Drew had to take a pause on the CreativeMornings. Global pandemic is raging on. Here in Minneapolis, we become the epicenter for a racial reckoning that just spirals out right in front of our eyes after the murder of George Floyd. And I'm sure many of you in this room asked yourselves a lot of questions about who you are and what you're doing. I did that very same thing during that time. And even though, again, basically working in Artful Living, being the editor-in-chief of a lifestyle magazine was what I wanted to do ever since I was making my Nelson News newsletter. It wasn't quite as glossy as Artful Living. But I started to really ask myself, can I use my time and talents to contribute to some greater good? Again, I'm sure these are questions you guys asked yourselves. And these are notions that as creatives that I think we wrestle with a lot. How do I simultaneously do work that's fulfilling for me personally? How do I feel like that's meaningful out there in the world? Small thing, how do I get paid to do those first two things? That's important too. Turns out those bills don't stop no matter how inspirational you are. And so I just sort of sat with that for a little while. Now I have a plot twist that I haven't yet revealed. In 2012, I'd mentioned that I grew up in Minnesota. In 2012, got a very surprising email from my estranged mom that basically shattered my whole sense of identity. So she told me that the man who had raised me, who had actually passed away in 2004, was not my biological father, and instead that my biological father was an Alaska Native man that she'd had an affair with when my family was living in Alaska. So I had grown up in that small northwestern Minnesota town thinking I was sort of just like everyone else. And this really, at this point I'm in my late 20s, this really took my sense of self and destroyed it. And I had a lot of things that I had to wrestle with at that time. I found my Alaska family. I reached out to them. Some of them were super open and kind. Others, like my birth father, he was not interested in meeting me. And so in 2016, in every step in this journey has been the hardest step I've taken. I took the really hard step of going to my birthplace and meeting my family and learning about my heritage. So, not only had my existing sense of self been shattered, but then I didn't know who I was. I knew that I belonged to this tribe called Tlingit. I didn't even know how to say that when I first saw it written out. I knew that there was this rich cultural history, but I didn't know any of the traditions. And I knew that there were people who were really going to be welcoming me into this community, but I also didn't know how I fit into it. Okay, so coming back to 2020, right? We're wondering what are we supposed to do with our lives in this world we find ourselves in? And so Sean Sherman, you might know him. He owns this restaurant called Wamni, really acclaimed Lala Lakota chef. He had not yet opened a Wamni. I'd been following his story, in part because I had discovered my own Alaska Native identity, but also just because what he was doing is really cool and really important. And so he was in the midst of opening a Wamni, and I thought, that's a story that people need to know about. So, and it sort of aligned with this idea of maybe I could do something that was contributing to some greater good. So I pitched it to an Esquire editor. Totally, it was a cold call. I'd never interacted with this person before. They responded. They picked up the story. They edited the story. They published the story. It got nominated for a James Beard Award. And I thought, this might mean that people like this. This might mean that I'm onto something. And so it started really organically. That story ran in 2021 when his restaurant opened. 2022, I started telling a few more stories. 2023, I wrote nearly one Indigenous-focused story a week. So these are some of the really important change makers who I have been lucky enough to profile, or topics, that they're really touching on, I've been able to cover. So that ranges from entertainment with Reservation Dogs and Killers of the Flower Moon, to foodways like Chef Sean Sherman, Chef Crystal Wapipa, and others. And also really hard-hitting stories as well, because you guys are hopefully seeing that there's this incredible sort of Native awakening that's taking place, where mainstream audiences are taking a lot more interest in Indigenous stories. That said, it's important for everyone to understand that tribal communities across the US face marked inequities. There are huge health disparities. We face higher violence rates, higher poverty rates, higher addiction rates. We have lower life expectancies. So sometimes, you think, well, colonialism, I think that happened a long time ago. However, these are the long-lasting effects that are still very apparent today. And so while there is the really sort of fun side of talking to Reservation Dogs showrunner Sterling Harjo about, his inspiration and, really being a front runner in Indigenous entertainment, we also need to acknowledge that these things are still taking place. So I find myself all of a sudden last year having a lot of editors who I'd never worked with reaching out to me saying, I hear you cover Indigenous topics. We want to do more of that. Can you do that for us? I also had a lot of Native individuals and organizations reaching out to me saying, I hear you cover Indigenous topics. We have a story that might be worthwhile. And I found myself really carving out this niche where, because I am Native American, that I do have that trust with a lot of these sources, and also I'm able to translate those stories for mainstream audiences who may not have knowledge of any of these topics or issues that are currently going on. So that was really incredible. It was super fulfilling, also super exhausting. 2023, I looked down to write something on my laptop, I looked back up, and it was October. And I realized that, I was putting all of my heart into these stories. I was still giving Artful Living my all. And the person who I was not giving enough to was myself. I think that's something that creatives unfortunately fall into, is that we feel so passionate about the work that we do that we sort of forget that we have some basic needs to be met as well. Turns out interacting with people you love, good thing. Taking care of yourself from a health perspective, also a good thing. And I realized that I could not hold all of these things. All very meaningful, all very important, but that I was not capable of doing all of it. So I had to really face the tough decision of, okay, well now what do I do? Because unless I'm going to, I guess somehow I'm going to have someone else take care of all of my friendship needs and my personal needs, I'm probably going to need to shift some of my attention to that. And that's when I made the decision that I was going to step away from the editor-in-chief role at Artful Living. It's a lot easier to leave a job or a company if you really dislike it. It is so challenging to leave something that you love and to leave something that has been your dream. So that's why Dream On, not about Aerosmith, but this idea of, as creatives, we are going to go through these seasons, these chapters in our lives where we have different dreams. We might have simultaneous dreams and be pulled in multiple directions. And having, I had to really, for myself, realize that having another dream that I was being pulled to did not mean that my dream of being editor-in-chief of Artful Living was no longer real. Both things can be true. That's the really complicated world that we live in. However, 2023, even though I was, sort of on that tightrope and thinking, I can't look down because I'll realize that I'm exhausted and I have to make decisions about how I'm going to be spending my time and efforts. 2023 for me really brought a lot of clarity of where are my talents, where is my time best spent in a way that right now other people aren't doing or might not be capable of doing. And that's when I realized where I really needed to go. And where back to that question in 2020, where I could contribute to, greater good in a really meaningful way. So, here's me. I was a total boss even back then. And here's me now. And I really feel like I have, in so many ways, stayed true, but also come back to who I am. Even back in those really early days, I was a storyteller. I wanted to be, making a difference. And after I had told so many stories of other Indigenous changemakers who were really vulnerable and candid with me, I, last November, finally felt ready to tell my own story. And so I, in an essay published in The Guardian, went through all of the very complicated, complex details of, how I ended up where I am, including, like I mentioned, going back to Alaska to really find myself and, having to grapple with feelings of being super, super imposter syndrome of, and if any of you live in multiple worlds, you might know that feeling of not being really enough for either world. And I've really come to terms, I still have to tell myself this every now and again, I still waffle a little bit on it, but that I am exactly who I need to be. I'm exactly where I need to be. And that I don't need to tell anyone or show anyone or prove to anyone what I am or what I'm not. And that includes, again, this idea of stepping away from what a lot of us would probably think is a dream job. And it is. So, takeaways. I would love for you guys to think about the dreams that you had when you were little. Because I think that those were really some of our most authentic yearnings. Because you don't get all of these, the complex ideas of what we're supposed to be doing as adults. That doesn't come until later. Usually as a kid, you really I also wanted to be a cheerleader. I can't do anything beyond a somersault, so I knew that wasn't going to happen. And then I thought, okay, well, cheerleaders off the books, but I always wanted to be telling stories. And so I'm really honored to be able to amplify these stories. And I do feel like I'm doing something that is really meaningful. Okay, back to takeaways. You probably know whether it's that dream that you had as a little kid, or whether it's a new dream that is sort of festering in your subconscious, that's really inconvenient because usually it doesn't align with what you're currently doing. Mm-hmm. And that's really hard because I want to tell you, it is totally acceptable and wonderful and beautiful to do something that you've been doing for a long time and it feels comfortable and it feels right. As creatives, we don't always have to be pushing. Sometimes there are periods of rest. But last year, I really found myself up for this challenge of how can I tell these stories in a way that matters? And the universe, in case I was questioning it, kept saying, well, she can't really decide where to go. Let's make it abundantly clear. Let's have more editors reach out to her and ask her to write this content, then I'd sort of ask a question, the universe would say, are you kidding me? She needs more support. So I would say, let those dreams fester, bring them to the front of your mind, let them be real. You might not know what to do with them. And that's how I felt in 2021 and even 2022, where I thought, I really like telling these stories about Native topics, but I don't really, I can't make a living out of that right now. I have a really good thing going. I'll think about that later. 2022, I'll think about that later. And finally, a couple years later, I was ready to actually think about it and have that, again, really tough conversation with myself. Quitting your job might not be the right path for everyone. Going back to that idea of those bills, they need to be paid. But are there ways, I spent 2 years really flexing this muscle while I was still doing my full-time job. It wasn't easy, like I said. There were definitely compromises that I was making. But it allowed me to explore that and realize, oh, this is real. This is really real. So I encourage you to, if you can, that might be something you do on the weekends, in the evenings. You show up to great, sessions like this where you get to interact with other creatives. But how can you support that? Because those things that we wanted to be when we were little, those things that are at the back of our mind, they don't go away. We can ignore them, but they don't miraculously go away. So, I really encourage you all to honor those things and embrace them. I was afraid of it for a long time because I thought, this means change. Change is hard. I had so many questions about it. There were so many unknowns. And there still are, for me, unknowns. Going into the freelance world, in the media industry that right now is very tumultuous with a ton of layoffs taking place, budgets being cut. But because I so strongly believe that this is my life's work, that certainty is really it, and the clients that I've accumulated over the past 2 years. It's not just the universe telling me to go that way. We still have to be practical. But that has really empowered me to go after this new dream. Final takeaway. You probably currently have multiple dreams. Having one does not negate the other. That's been, I think, in this messy middle that I'm currently going through as I prepare to step down as editor-in-chief. That's been one of the hardest things for me to recognize, is that just because I'm moving toward one dream, it doesn't negate that, again, being the editor-in-chief of Artful Living for so long was my dream. And that's a really beautiful thing. As creatives, we need to allow ourselves to nurture, to honor, to embrace all of those things. All right, one last thing. This is oversized environmental installation by my friend who's a fellow Tlingit tribal member. His name's Nicholas Glannon. He was actually in town for the Great Northern and headlined a concert at First Ave. I'm pretty sure it was the first time that First Ave featured all Indigenous musicians. How incredible is that? Mm-hmm. He has this not so subtle reminder that wherever you go, you are on Indigenous land. What does that mean? That you are on land that is the historical ancestral homelands of a certain group of people. There's a lot of talk these days about land back. Lots of people have concerns and fears and trying to understand, what does all of this mean? I encourage you to, no matter where you are, to learn about the community whose land you're on, and to try to understand the issues that community might be facing. And if you can, think about how you can make a positive impact. That's really, why I'm shifting to doing this work, because, I call them Indigenous issues, but they're not Indigenous issues. They're human issues that happen to disproportionately affect a certain population. And I hope that we, as humans, can all understand that we have a stake in uplifting our fellow mankind and womankind and every kind. And that we can be really thoughtful in how we're doing that. And that might be in the work we're doing, that might be the things that we do during our personal time, that might be the books we read, the media that we share, on Instagram, things like that. Especially this year as we're looking ahead to a presidential election, let's just be really mindful of, again, what's going on out there with communities beyond our own. All right, that's my TED Talk.
Thanks, Kate. Amazing, amazing. Another round of applause. Thank you for sharing your story.